"Mom, did you enjoy the lake house?" James asked casually as he sipped his coffee at the polished kitchen island. I froze, the words hanging in the air like a sudden chill that seeped through the room. My hand paused over the teacup, gripping it tighter than necessary, the porcelain cool against my fingers. The morning sun filtered through the half-open blinds, casting stripes of light and shadow across the hardwood floor, and I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the street outside. For a moment, I couldn't decide whether to laugh, to ask a question, or to simply retreat into silence. The smell of cinnamon from the leftover pumpkin pie still on the counter reminded me it was Thanksgiving, a day I had anticipated with quiet optimism, imagining the house filled with warmth and the familiar chatter of family around the table. Clara lingered by the refrigerator, her hands folded in front of her, eyes darting between us with that carefully practiced smile that never quite reached her gaze. I had always known something in her demeanor was meticulous, precise, each movement measured, but today, it pressed on me differently, like a weight I couldn't place. I remembered the early mornings when I had cleaned and polished every corner of this house, the countless dinners I had prepared, each recipe honed over decades, all in the hope of creating a home where my children felt loved and welcomed. Now, the thought of generosity met with such ambiguity made my chest tighten. I reminded myself to breathe, the air feeling thick in my lungs, each inhale measured and deliberate. My mind raced through the past 2 years since I had been widowed, the way life had quietly shifted, how James had grown more distant, his visits shorter, his voice brisk and polite, yet lacking the warmth I once knew. The house, my home, suddenly felt expansive and hollow, each familiar piece of furniture carrying echoes of memories that seemed to mock me. I noticed Clara's eyes flicker toward the phone on the counter, her hand brushing over it, as if ensuring it was silent, her lips pressing together in a thin line. Something didn't fit, some invisible puzzle piece had moved. I thought of all the small signs I had brushed aside, the misdirected letters, the delayed deliveries, the explanations that never quite added up. And yet, here she was, standing innocently by the refrigerator, pretending oblivion, while the question from James felt like a key turning in a lock I had forgotten existed. I set the cup down carefully, forcing my body to remain still, my mind cataloging each detail, each gesture, each slight hesitation, piecing together the pattern that had been forming quietly over time. The room felt charged with unspoken tension, the clinking of silverware in the dishwasher in the background sounding unnaturally loud. "Helen," I reminded myself silently, "stay calm. Observe. Wait." Your response will be measured, deliberate, a silent assertion of control in a situation that sought to unbalance you. Clara's gaze met mine for a brief second, and in that instant, I caught the shadow of calculation, the way she measured her words and actions, as if life itself were a board game she intended to master. I allowed a faint smile, neutral and controlled, to settle on my lips, revealing nothing, concealing everything, and in that measured expression lay the quiet power of restraint. The sunlight shifted slightly, glinting off the crystal handle of the coffee pot, and I focused on the minute details. The way the tablecloth had been ironed so perfectly, the slight unevenness of the curtain folds, the way the room seemed too still, too composed, betraying a sense of orchestration beneath the surface. I sat down at the small breakfast nook, the chair creaking softly under my weight, and I imagined the steps I would take, the observations I would log, the truths I would uncover, all while maintaining the outward semblance of composure expected of a mother and widow on Thanksgiving morning. Every fiber of my being was alert, not in panic, but in silent calculation, measuring, remembering, and preparing. The aroma of roasted turkey from the oven mingled with the scent of pine from the modest centerpiece I had arranged, a comforting reminder of tradition, and yet the day felt tainted by uncertainty. My eyes traveled over James as he leaned back casually, unaware of the tension rippling beneath the surface, and I noted the way Clara's fingers fidgeted with a napkin, betraying her otherwise composed exterior. I took a slow breath, letting the weight of observation anchor me, letting the quiet of the morning stretch, giving me space to consider, to remember, to anticipate. I felt the sting of betrayal not in words yet spoken, but in the almost imperceptible cues, the subtle manipulation, the arrangement of circumstances that pointed to a truth that I had only just begun to perceive. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the polished countertops and the faint dust motes dancing in the light, I remained seated, still, attentive, the room holding its collective breath as if waiting for my next move, a moment of calm within the storm of realizations yet to unfold. The day moved slowly, each hour stretching longer than the last, and Helen found herself drifting through the house with quiet attention to detail. She walked into the living room, her fingers brushing over the edge of the mantel where family photographs were carefully arranged. Each frame held memories of birthdays, graduations, and ordinary moments that had once seemed trivial but now carried a weight she could not ignore. The sunlight fell in stripes across the carpet, highlighting tiny imperfections she had never noticed before, and she found herself cataloging them mentally, an unconscious exercise in order and observation. She poured herself a glass of water, the cool liquid offering a momentary sense of grounding, and sat at the small writing desk by the window, gazing at the street outside where leaves drifted in lazy spirals. Her thoughts returned to the subtle cues she had noted over the past months, the delayed replies to her messages, the carefully curated social media posts that seemed designed to exclude her, the casual remarks that hinted at plans she had no part of. Helen sipped slowly, letting the quiet fill the space, noting the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the kitchen clock, and the way the light shifted as the day moved toward afternoon. She reflected on the meals she had prepared over the years, the effort to create a home that nurtured family bonds, and the patience she had exercised when her efforts were met with indifference. Her attention drifted to Clara, who moved about the kitchen with practiced ease, seemingly unaware of Helen's gaze. Yet Helen noticed the tiny hesitations in her movements, the way she lingered slightly too long over certain tasks, the way her smile never fully softened. Helen remembered the quiet moments when she had been alone, the early mornings spent preparing breakfast, the evenings organizing closets or ironing linens, small acts of care that had gone unnoticed yet shaped the rhythm of household life. The contrast between her steady efforts and the casual disregard she now observed created a tension that she held in check, measured in each deliberate breath and movement. She opened the mail that had arrived that morning, sifting through envelopes with a calm, methodical precision, noting the consistency of dates, the timeliness of delivery, and yet, nothing overtly out of place, just enough to sustain the nagging uncertainty that had taken root. Helen moved to the kitchen counter and ran her fingers along the smooth surface, thinking about the conversations she had with James over the past few weeks, the subtle changes in his tone, the indirect ways he addressed plans and decisions without consulting her. Each observation was filed away quietly, stored in the deep recesses of her mind for reflection and careful consideration. She filled the kettle for tea, the gentle hiss of steam a familiar comfort, and as she watched the water swirl and bubble, she felt the faint thrill of control in her awareness, in her ability to see what others might overlook. The house was quiet but alive with small sounds, the refrigerator, the distant traffic, the wind brushing against the window panes. Helen allowed herself to notice them all, recording the subtle rhythms, each one a clue in the unfolding pattern she was beginning to piece together. She straightened the tablecloth in the dining room, the corners precise, the folds symmetrical, and allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement of her diligence, a quiet assertion of presence and capability. Every detail mattered, from the polished surfaces to the precise alignment of chairs, a silent testimony to her careful attention and the life she had built. As the afternoon light waned, Helen moved through the rooms, observing, cataloging, and reflecting, her mind alert yet calm. The sensation of power in knowing quietly what others might never realize, holding it close, letting it inform her next steps without revealing the depth of understanding she carried within. Helen moved quietly toward the dining room, her footsteps muffled against the hardwood floor, her eyes tracing the familiar contours of the room she had maintained for decades. Each chair, each placemat, each centerpiece seemed to hold a story, and she cataloged them in her mind with the same care she had always applied. The kettle on the stove hissed softly, a mundane sound that grounded her as she reflected on the subtle behaviors she had observed over the past months. James spoke occasionally from the living room, discussing plans and appointments with a tone that was polite but distant, each word measured and deliberate, revealing nothing of the warmth she had once known. Clara moved about the kitchen with efficiency, her posture impeccable, yet Helen noticed the fleeting hesitations in her gestures, the way she paused just slightly too long over certain tasks, the way her smile, though carefully constructed, never fully softened her eyes. Helen poured herself another glass of water, the liquid cool and steadying, and took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the calm rise within her as she observed. Her gaze returned to the photographs lining the mantel, images capturing moments of family celebrations, birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days that had once felt ephemeral but now carried weight. The contrast between past care and present distance settling in a quiet, insistent way. She moved to the window, watching leaves drift lazily along the street, the sunlight shifting, highlighting small details she might have missed before, each observation building a tapestry of understanding. Helen thought of the countless times she had prepared meals, ironed linens, and arranged furniture to create a home that nurtured love and connection, and she contrasted those efforts with the subtle indifference she now sensed, the careful orchestration of appearances by Clara and the polite distance maintained by James. Every minor discrepancy, every slight change in tone or gesture became a thread in the larger picture she was quietly assembling. Helen allowed herself a small, internal acknowledgement of her own attentiveness, a quiet assertion of awareness and control, noting how she could remain composed while perceiving so much that others assumed she did not see. The afternoon light shifted, glinting off the crystal handles of the cabinet doors, illuminating the room in streaks that made the polished surfaces gleam, and she focused on these reflections, allowing the mundane beauty of the house to anchor her while her mind worked through the subtle puzzles of behavior and intention. Helen straightened the tablecloth with precision, aligning the edges, smoothing the fabric with careful hands, an act that felt simultaneously ordinary and symbolic, reinforcing her presence and her attention to detail. She observed Clara as she moved past, noting the way her hands lingered slightly longer than necessary over certain objects, the way her gaze flitted momentarily to her phone, and Helen cataloged it all, storing each observation for reflection and eventual action. The house remained quiet, yet it vibrated with unspoken tension, each small sound, the humming refrigerator, the distant street, the faint rustle of leaves outside, gathering significance. Helen allowed herself to remain still, her posture relaxed but alert, letting her awareness extend through the space, capturing nuances that might otherwise go unnoticed. She considered the patterns, the repeated gestures, the micro-behaviors that now seemed purposeful, and she felt a quiet determination settle over her, a sense of agency within a situation designed to unsettle her. Every detail she observed, every small shift in behavior, contributed to her growing understanding, and she remained poised, aware, and deliberate, moving through the afternoon with measured attention, cataloging, reflecting, and preparing for the unfolding realization of truths that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Helen walked slowly into the sunroom, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor, and she allowed herself a quiet moment to take in the familiar surroundings. The space had always been her sanctuary, filled with houseplants carefully tended, a small reading nook by the window, and the faint scent of lavender from the sachets tucked into drawers. She traced her fingers along the spines of books lined neatly on the shelves, recalling hours spent reading and annotating, the quiet companionship they had offered during years when the house felt empty. Outside, the leaves on the maple tree twirled gently in the breeze, brushing against the window pane, creating patterns of movement that seemed almost deliberate. Helen noted the subtle dissonance between the serene environment and the tension she felt inside, a reminder that appearances often hid more than they revealed. She considered the interactions of the morning, how James had spoken with practiced casualness, how Clara had moved through the kitchen with a fluid precision that belied a careful orchestration of behavior. Helen remembered the countless times she had organized family gatherings, arranged table settings, and planned meals with meticulous care, all to cultivate an atmosphere of warmth and connection, and she reflected on the contrast between those efforts and the subtle manipulation she now sensed. Each detail, from the placement of a teacup to the way sunlight hit the countertops, became a part of her internal record, cataloging observations for later reflection. She allowed herself to pause, breathing in deeply, feeling the textures of the room under her fingertips, the slight give of the armchair cushion, the smoothness of the tabletop, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Helen's mind wandered back to earlier holidays, the sound of laughter that had once filled the space, the aroma of carefully prepared dinners, the small joys of shared traditions, and she contrasted them with the current atmosphere of measured politeness and subtle distance. She noted Clara's careful movements, the brief hesitations, the slight glances toward her phone, cataloging them without judgment, simply observing the rhythm and intention. Helen moved to straighten a small stack of coasters, aligning them perfectly, feeling the calm focus of deliberate action, the silent reassurance that she retained agency within the space. Each movement reinforced her awareness, each observation a quiet assertion of control, an unspoken acknowledgement that she could see what others assumed remained hidden. The sunlight shifted again, illuminating dust particles in a slow, steady stream, and Helen allowed herself to consider the broader pattern of interactions, the recurring moments of exclusion, the subtle manipulations that had begun to reveal themselves with increasing clarity. She seated herself in the reading nook, folding her hands in her lap, letting the quiet envelop her while she thought through the nuances of behavior, timing, and intention. Helen considered the coming days, the need to remain alert, patient, and measured, recognizing the strength inherent in composure and observation. As she watched the shadows lengthen across the floor and the wind stirred the curtains, she felt a deep, calm awareness, a readiness to act not in haste or emotion, but with the quiet, deliberate precision that had defined her life in this house. Every detail mattered, every gesture observed, every nuance recorded silently within her mind, forming a quiet, powerful map of understanding and intention. Helen moved back into the kitchen, her movements deliberate and quiet, letting her eyes scan the familiar surfaces and objects with a careful attention. She noticed the slight smudge on the counter where Clara had rested her hand, the faint fingerprint left on the polished glass cabinet, and the alignment of utensils on the dining table, each small detail speaking volumes to Helen even as it might appear ordinary to others. She poured herself another cup of tea, the warmth seeping through her hands, a small comfort as she reflected on the patterns she had begun to recognize. The refrigerator hummed softly, the oven timer chimed briefly, and the faint ticking of the wall clock created a rhythm that seemed almost meditative. Helen thought of James, his casual manner and carefully neutral tone, how he had delivered the question earlier in a way that was both casual and loaded, a subtle test of her reaction. Clara moved about silently, seemingly absorbed in organizing the pantry. Yet Helen noticed the fleeting glances and micro-adjustments, the faint signs of calculation beneath an outwardly smooth demeanor. She walked to the sideboard, adjusting a vase slightly, realigning a stack of plates, each movement grounding her and providing focus. Her mind wandered back to previous Thanksgivings, the smell of roasted turkey filling the air, the laughter and chatter of family members gathered around the table, and she contrasted those memories with the quiet, charged atmosphere of the present moment. Helen reflected on the effort she had put into creating a home of order, comfort, and warmth, and the subtle ways that effort had been overlooked, manipulated, or taken for granted. She considered the implications of what she had observed, the patterns forming a clear picture of intentions that had remained hidden until now. Each detail, from the alignment of the silverware to the slight hesitation in a glance, contributed to a growing understanding that was both precise and quiet, the kind of understanding that required observation, patience, and restraint. Helen allowed herself a moment of calm, sipping her tea slowly, noting the weight of the cup in her hands, the comforting aroma, the way the steam curled gently upward. She moved through the space with measured steps, touching the smooth surfaces, feeling the textures of the countertop and the table, the softness of a chair cushion, letting these small, tactile details anchor her as she observed. The afternoon light continued to shift, highlighting subtle nuances in the room, casting patterns of shadow and warmth that she cataloged silently, aware of how the changing light revealed hidden aspects of the familiar space. Helen considered her own capacity for patience and strategic observation, the strength inherent in composure and attentiveness, and she let herself feel the quiet empowerment that came from knowing more than she revealed. The house was filled with ordinary sounds, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic, the wind brushing against the windows. But each sound carried significance, and Helen cataloged them carefully, building a map of awareness that extended beyond the immediate view. She straightened the napkins on the table, aligned the chairs, and adjusted a small centerpiece, actions that were mundane yet deliberate, reinforcing both her presence and her clarity of observation. Every small adjustment, every measured step, and every moment of careful attention strengthened her understanding, grounding her in a quiet, observant power as the day continued to unfold and the subtleties of behavior and intention became ever more apparent. Helen moved toward the study, her steps deliberate and measured, the soft patter of her shoes against the hardwood floor filling the quiet house. She paused at the doorway, observing James seated at the desk with his laptop open, papers spread neatly around him, focused on the screen but occasionally glancing toward Clara as she organized files on the shelf. Helen took a slow breath, letting the familiar scent of polished wood and paper anchor her, a comforting reminder of the home she had maintained for decades. She noted the way Clara's fingers lingered over certain folders, the slight tightening of her jaw, the careful attention to appearances that seemed effortless yet precise. Helen walked further into the room, her eyes scanning the arrangement of furniture, the alignment of objects on the desk, the careful stacking of books, cataloging every detail with quiet attention. She moved to a small side table, adjusting the angle of a lamp just slightly, realigning a stack of notebooks, and in those simple actions found a grounding rhythm, a way to focus her thoughts. Helen recalled earlier mornings spent preparing for family gatherings, organizing the kitchen, planning meals down to the last detail, and the contrast between those efforts and the subtle manipulations she now perceived created a quiet, simmering awareness. She allowed herself to observe James and Clara, noting the small signs of coordination, the unspoken communication, the patterns of behavior that revealed intentions she had not previously understood. Helen straightened the papers on her own desk, smoothing the surfaces with careful hands, each motion reinforcing her sense of control and presence. The afternoon light shifted across the room, highlighting dust motes in slow, deliberate patterns, the sunlight reflecting off the polished surfaces in a way that drew her attention to details she might have previously overlooked. Helen allowed her mind to trace the implications of her observations, considering the small discrepancies, the subtle timing of actions, the careful orchestration of movements and words, building a silent map of understanding. She moved toward the window, watching the movement of leaves in the gentle breeze, the shadows stretching across the floor, each shift an opportunity to note and reflect, each subtle cue contributing to her growing comprehension. Helen sat in the armchair near the desk, folding her hands in her lap, letting her posture remain calm and composed while her mind cataloged every gesture, every glance, every small action, recognizing their significance without needing to confront or react openly. She considered the coming days, the careful patience required, the subtle ways she could maintain dignity and awareness while assessing the full extent of intentions, holding the quiet power of observation close. Each detail mattered, from the tilt of a book to the angle of a lamp, each tiny signal a clue, and Helen held them all in the deliberate stillness of her awareness, ready to act with clarity when the moment arrived. The house remained quiet, filled with ordinary sounds, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant street traffic, the gentle shifting of curtains in the breeze. But Helen listened to each one with attention, letting them inform her understanding, reinforcing her calm, collected presence as she prepared for what might unfold next. Helen returned to the living room, moving with careful, deliberate steps, her eyes taking in every detail of the familiar space. The sunlight from the late afternoon filtered through the blinds, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the sofa and coffee table. She allowed herself a slow, steady breath, feeling the rhythm of the room, the quiet hum of the heating system, and the faint noise of traffic from the street outside. Clara was arranging magazines on the side table, her movements precise, almost choreographed, yet Helen noticed the brief hesitation in her hands, the subtle pause as if she was considering each action carefully. James was seated in the armchair by the window, reading through some documents with focused attention, unaware that Helen was silently observing the small exchanges and micro-behaviors occurring around him. Helen moved to straighten the cushions on the sofa, aligning them perfectly, feeling the quiet satisfaction of small, controlled movements, each one grounding her as she assessed the scene. She recalled previous gatherings, the laughter, the warmth, the sense of Thanksgiving meals, and she contrasted those memories with the current stillness, the subtle tension beneath the surface of polite conversation and routine movements. Helen observed Clara adjusting a frame on the wall, noting the almost imperceptible shift of weight and glance toward James, cataloging it all silently, aware that these small gestures carried significance. She walked over to the coffee table and aligned the coasters with meticulous care, feeling the grounding effect of her attention and the quiet power of observation. The shifting sunlight illuminated dust particles in the air, revealing small details on the polished surfaces, and Helen let her eyes travel over them, noting every mark, every reflection, every subtle clue. She reflected on the careful orchestration she had observed in subtle behaviors, timing of actions, and patterns of speech, and she allowed herself a quiet acknowledgement of the growing clarity forming in her mind. Helen sipped her tea slowly, noticing the warmth, the subtle aroma, and the way the cup felt steady in her hands, providing a moment of calm amid the mental cataloging of observations. She considered the patterns in the interactions of James and Clara, the timing, the gestures, the glances, and recognized the deliberate nature of what had previously seemed ordinary. Each small action, each minor shift, reinforced the awareness she carried, allowing her to plan and anticipate without revealing any outward tension. Helen straightened the lamp on the sideboard, adjusted the angle of a decorative piece, and walked slowly around the room, absorbing the energy, noting the atmosphere, cataloging every detail, and understanding the underlying intentions without verbal confrontation. The house was filled with ordinary sounds, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the subtle hum of appliances, the distant street noises, but each one was part of the fabric she was quietly mapping. Helen allowed herself a moment of calm, sitting in the reading chair by the window, folding her hands in her lap, letting the room and its small nuances reinforce her awareness, and she felt a quiet, deliberate sense of power in knowing without needing to act impulsively. Every observed gesture, every micro-behavior, every subtle inconsistency contributed to a map of understanding that she held internally, ready to guide her future actions with precision and composure. Helen walked to the sun-drenched breakfast nook, her steps slow and deliberate, letting her senses absorb every detail of the room. The soft afternoon light streamed through the wide windows, highlighting the polished oak floors and the carefully arranged table set for a simple meal. She placed her teacup on the edge of the counter, letting her eyes wander over the room with careful scrutiny, noting the placement of each chair, the alignment of the placemats, the slight imperfections that were invisible to anyone else but meaningful to her trained attention. Clara moved through the kitchen with controlled movements, gathering dishes and utensils with efficiency, yet Helen caught the subtle moments where her fingers lingered just a fraction too long, her gaze darting quickly toward James, who was seated at the table with documents spread before him, reading and occasionally flipping pages with a practiced, composed air. Helen's mind cataloged these observations with quiet precision, each gesture and glance a piece of a puzzle slowly revealing itself. She reflected on the countless mornings spent arranging the house, preparing meals, and ensuring everything was orderly, and she contrasted those memories with the subtle manipulation she now perceived, the careful orchestration of appearances that masked underlying intentions. Helen moved to straighten a small vase on the counter, the adjustment minor but grounding, allowing her to focus on the rhythm of the space and the movements within it. She noticed the way Clara's posture shifted slightly as she moved past, the micro-adjustments, the brief hesitations, and the calculated steps that suggested a pattern beyond ordinary household activity. Helen allowed herself a slow, deep breath, the aroma of freshly brewed tea filling the room and providing a steadying presence as she considered the interactions that had occurred throughout the morning. She thought of the patterns she had seen over the past weeks, the subtle changes in tone, the careful navigation of tasks and spaces, and the small cues that had previously seemed inconsequential but now revealed a coherent narrative. Helen adjusted the napkins on the table with precise hands, each fold and alignment reinforcing her awareness and attention to detail. The shifting sunlight created patterns of shadow and illumination across the counters and floors, and Helen let her eyes travel over each, noting reflections, slight scuffs, and minor imperfections, all contributing to her internal map of observation. She considered the careful coordination of Clara and James, their timing, gestures, and the unspoken communication she had now begun to understand, and she felt a quiet sense of control in her awareness. Helen moved to the edge of the window, resting her hands on the sill and observing the wind stirring the leaves outside, cataloging the motions and sounds with an attentive focus. She reflected on her own patience, the strength found in stillness and perception, and the ability to see and understand without confrontation. Every small action, glance, and gesture contributed to her growing clarity, and she held that knowledge quietly, a poised and deliberate observer within the house she had maintained for decades, ready to respond with measured precision when the time was right. Helen took another sip of her tea, feeling the warmth and stability, and allowed herself to remain seated, alert, and composed, watching, noticing, and quietly preparing for the moments ahead as the day stretched onward. Helen settled into the quiet corner of the living room, letting the fading light of the late afternoon cast long, soft shadows across the polished hardwood floor. She took a slow, steady breath, allowing her senses to absorb the subtle shifts in the space around her. The soft hum of the heating system mingled with the distant sounds of traffic, the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window adding a rhythm to the stillness. She allowed her eyes to wander over the familiar furnishings, noting the careful arrangement of the sofa cushions, the alignment of books on the shelves, the polished surface of the coffee table, each detail reflecting both the care she had invested over the years and the subtle signs of orchestrated appearances by James and Clara. Helen observed Clara, who moved about with calm efficiency, yet there was a fraction of hesitation in her steps, a glance toward James, and a subtle pause that Helen cataloged silently, understanding the unspoken coordination between them. James occasionally glanced at his papers, his tone polite but distant, each word deliberate, revealing nothing of the warmth she had once known, and Helen considered the layers of behavior that hinted at the underlying intentions. She moved to straighten a small decorative vase on the sideboard, adjusting it just slightly, a minor act that helped anchor her focus and maintain a sense of presence. Helen reflected on the numerous times she had prepared holiday meals, arranged gatherings, and organized spaces to nurture family connection, and contrasted those memories with the careful orchestration of appearances she now noticed, the subtle signals that conveyed exclusion without overt confrontation. She allowed herself to pause, lifting her teacup, savoring the warmth and aroma, and letting the simple action bring clarity as she assessed the patterns of behavior surrounding her. Helen's eyes followed Clara as she briefly paused to adjust a photograph, noting the micro-gestures, the fleeting shifts in posture, and the precise timing of movements that all contributed to a larger picture of intent. She cataloged these details, holding them internally without immediate response, each observation reinforcing her awareness and control. The late sunlight shifted through the windows, illuminating dust particles and highlighting the textures of the polished surfaces, creating a visual map that Helen interpreted as part of the environment's subtle narrative. She considered the sequence of microactions, the unspoken communication, the gestures and glances that revealed coordination, and she felt a quiet empowerment in understanding without needing to act impulsively. Helen adjusted the edge of the rug under her chair, aligned the cushions once more, and sat back, observing the room with deliberate patience, her mind attentive to the subtleties of timing, expression, and presence. Each ordinary sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the wall clock, the distant rustle of leaves, was processed as information, part of the fabric of her observation. Helen remained still, composed, and quietly confident in her awareness, cataloging every detail, every nuance, every shift in behavior, understanding the patterns and preparing herself for the subtle, measured actions she would take when the moment called for them, holding a steady, calm vigilance as the day waned into evening.